Ladies and gentlemen, those who don't know me, I'm Judge Rutherford. Let me, our guests, let me welcome you to Pike County. We are America's energy capital. If we were a state, we'd be 10th in co-production in America. We produce 53% of the natural gas in the Commonwealth. But that's the plus we have. The Lord has put a lot of minerals in the bowels of the earth here in Pike County. But folks, we are flood prone. This is my sixth term, not consecutive, but I've had 21 declarations, one for snow. I've had two from water from the sky that came down on us. All the rest of the floods have been river flooding, backwater that's flooded us. So we are flood prone. We worked after the 77 flood. I was in office during that. I went to Washington, testified before Congress for flood insurance for an agency that would take over and coordinate flooding. Prior to that, HUD has been the federal agency that did it. So we are flood prone. It is a sad time. We have the most resilient people of anywhere in this country that has been through so much and been flooded so many times. We're blessed today to have many agencies represented here. We're glad Nancy Price got to have you up here from the Emergency Management Office in Frankfort, and Mr. Johnson and his group, and others from the Kentucky Division of Water. But this is an important meeting. This won't be the first one. Because of lack of federal funding in Washington, they have decided to phase the county. And you have two areas this time, but we'll be back. One thing that you'll get information here on too, that this is not only for flooding, it's for mudslides. So if you live on a hill, you still could have problems from it. But flood insurance, we brought it in. It wasn't a popular thing to do. It became a political issue and said you zoned the county, telling people what to do with your horse, cow, pig. But we did the right thing in 1970, and ever when it was put in. We did the right thing for the people of this county to try to ease their burden. We're fortunate to be able to get funding to move some people out of the floodplain. We have $7 million, about half from FEMA and about half from USDA, Department of Agriculture. We're in the process now. Jeannie Robinson over here in my office handles one of it, and Jimmy Kaiser and Mr. Stacy here in my office handles the other side of it on the FEMA. But we are trying to get people out of the floodplain. It's taken us years to try to say, quit putting these people back in the floodplain. If you can, buy them out. But we're here for this important meeting this afternoon. You will get all the information that you need today. And you'll be surprised of the technology that these people have available and that they can answer your questions. So yes, it's important. Yes, we're going to have the rest of the county mapped. They will ended up, I presume, Mr. Johnson doing the entire county as they go. They'll because of lack of money. Normally they do the entire county. Takes them about 4 or 5 years, if I remember. That takes time to do it. But this time, since they phased it and did certain areas in the county, and the reason for that was the 2009 flood, and then we had the 2010 flood. Back-to-back declarations by myself, the governor of the Commonwealth, and the president. So we want to thank you all for coming and meeting the federal guidelines, which they, in regard to this remapping. And if we can answer any question for you, we're fortunate to have good people. Right here's 3 of them, with Brandon sitting over there in county government, that's our media fella. But these are the people that have the everyday responsibility. And Jimmy Kaiser, and we couldn't do it without him. Mr. Maynard with our mapping system. We have pectometry, something not a lot of counties have. We have the most latest technology in our emergency management office and Doug Tackett. So we're blessed here to have good people to look out for us, and that's what they'll be here. And if you have any questions, you can call my office or call Jimmy Kaiser's office, because Jimmy is highly qualified in regard to the floodplains in this county, and he can answer your questions after these folks are here. But I think they can do a commendable job, and they will do a commendable job. And I think you'll have some information, and you'll be able to communicate in the future and understand what flood insurance is, what it means, and what the remapping means. Thank you all, and God bless, and thank all of you people who are here today to answer our citizens' questions.
Thank you, Judge Rutherford. Again, my name's Kerry Johnson. I'm with the Kentucky Division of Water. I'm the program manager for the flood hazard and risk map programs at the Division of Water. And basically what that means is the Division of Water works with FEMA Region 4 out of Atlanta, Georgia, to identify and mitigate flood hazards within the Commonwealth. And flood hazards change over time, and also the technology in order to identify those flood hazards change over time. So one of the things that we've done here in parts of Pike County is use latest and greatest technology to identify the flood hazards as they are today in the county, to depict them on revised flood insurance rate maps. And flood insurance rate maps, or FIRMs for short, are a tool used by many different entities, one of those entities being your local emergency and floodplain managers, to properly manage the floodplains. The idea being, if you can, get people out of harm's way. But also they're used by mortgage lenders in order for flood insurance purchase requirements, and that's some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. But really quickly, I brought a whole team of folks with me today. If they could quickly stand up so that the folks in the room can identify you guys. This is our team. We have representatives from the Division of Water, URS, and AECOM, who are contract firms that work with the Division of Water in revising the flood maps. So I'm going to go through a quick presentation. I don't want to take up too much of your time with the presentation, because I know everyone wants to see how the new maps affect their properties. But we have paper maps on the far end of the room. We also have all the digital maps here at the table right here. So we can use some of the information provided by the county. Wonderful information here in the county. I would say one of the best data-rich counties in the state. We can use that information, zoom right to your county, and show you your house and what the effects of the maps are on your particular structure. So real quickly, what we're going to do is we're going to explain what the National Flood Insurance Program is, talk about the maps quickly. There were some changes from the maps that were done in 2008, and a lot of that is attributed to better information in order to identify the flood hazard. And as I mentioned before, those flood hazards do change over time due to changes in the watershed, development, and just the way water runs off some of the mountains and hills and gets to the streams. And we'll also be talking about flood insurance and the impacts on your individual properties and businesses. The National Flood Insurance Program is a federal program that enables property owners in participating communities to purchase flood insurance, federally subsidized backed flood insurance. One of the provisions of entering the National Flood Insurance Program is a community must adopt and enforce a local floodplain management ordinance, which the city of Pikeville, Pike County have done that. So we've revised some of the maps due to some of the provisions of the flood insurance program. In order to accomplish some of the goals outlined by the federal government and state government and ultimately the local governments for the flood insurance program, is you have to identify the risk that's out there. And that's what these maps, one of the things the maps do is they identify the flood risk as it is today. It's going to change. That's why the idea is for us to continually cycle through these maps and update them with the latest and greatest information that we have at our fingertips. Educating the public on risk. There is a risk to flooding in Pike County, as Judge Rutherford mentioned, 21 presidential disaster declaration in his terms alone. Now, there's some different reasons why that may have occurred, but flooding occurs often in Pike County. It will likely continue to occur, And what the NFIP, or one of the provisions of the NFIP, is to encourage development away from floodplain areas if at all possible. Really quickly, as far as the new study is concerned, we sent your community leaders a set of preliminary maps to take a look at and provide comments to us back in January of this year. We revised 54 of the over 200 map panels that were already in the county. So basically what that means is this is a partial update, and a lot of that is due to some of the limited funding that we've received from the federal and state governments in order to accomplish these goals. Studied a little over 200 miles of streams within the county, and those stream and their flood hazards are depicted on the revised maps. So going over some of the important dates, as I mentioned before, we disseminated the preliminary maps in January of this year. We had a meeting with your local officials to discuss the maps in February. There was a due process period that was 90 days long that began in May and ended in July of this year. There's a very protracted, I would say, due process period for these maps. Part of that is issuing a letter to the local officials letting you know when these new maps will go effective, and that's what the letter of final determination is basically telling the communities and also the folks within those communities when these new maps go into effect, and that'll be April 16th of 2013. So what that means is the current maps from 2008 are the legal flood hazard identification documents for Pike County and City of Pikeville until such date as these maps replace those, and that is April 16th of 2013. So as far as flood insurance is concerned, I'll get into the actual what flood risk is, and as FEMA defines it, nearly everyone is at risk to flooding. You don't have to live in a high-risk area to get a flood, and we've seen that from just recently with tropical storm, Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm, Frankenstorm, whatever you want to call it. Things can happen that can cause flooding in areas that normally wouldn't flood. So that's why FEMA generally says that nearly everyone is at risk for flooding. Know what your risk is, and that's what these maps do. They identify areas of high risk, moderate risk, and low risk on the maps. And like I mentioned before, we have the maps around. Part of our team can certainly educate everyone on what those different zones mean. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask us after the presentation. What I always like to do is, if there's any general questions, please feel free to ask those. If you have specific questions about your properties, come and talk to our team, and we'll zoom right to your house and show you what the effects are. So those high-risk areas are depicted as a Zone A or a Zone AE on the maps. They're the blue areas on the flood insurance rate maps. The moderate risks basically identify the 500 or 0.2 annual percent chance flood zone. Lots of people call it the 500-year flood zone, but that's a shaded Zone X on the maps. And then everything outside those shaded Zone X and Zone A areas on the maps are the areas of low risk. Flood insurance. Flood insurance is one of the provisions of a federally backed loan if you are in an identified high-risk area on the flood insurance rate maps. In addition, there's a state law, KRS 151, that requires a floodplain construction permit for any area along or across a stream identified on the maps. And also there's a local permitting authority through Jimmy Kaiser's office for the stream construction permit process. So we have Abby Rains from the Division of Water, who's our National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator. She's our local specialist and expert as far as the flood insurance program is concerned. So we're here to help you. Please use us as a resource. That's your taxpayers. That's why we're here, and we're working for the government. I don't know how I got a calculator up there. Grandfathering provisions. Since there are new areas identified, flood-prone areas identified on the maps, there is a grandfathering provision as part of the map revision process. And basically what that means is if you are in a newly identified flood hazard area or the flood elevations have gone up in your area, you can be grandfathered into the new map. So basically what that means is if you're newly identified, you want to get, and you will have to have flood insurance and you have a federally backed loan, get your flood insurance before April of 2013 so you will be grandfathered into the new map. So I want to say that again. You know, if you are in a flood hazard area and you do have a federally backed loan, the flood insurance will be a provision of your mortgage, and that is a federal regulation. But there are these provisions in order to be grandfathered into the new maps, and can save everyone potentially quite a bit of money if you do have to buy the flood insurance as part of your loan. In addition, whenever you create a map, there's always limitations as far as scale is concerned. So FEMA has an administrative process for individual properties and some larger areas. If you can provide information that shows your basically the lowest adjacent grade, the lowest part of your property that touches the ground is higher than the flood elevations. One of the things about these maps is we have flood elevations for every study on every floodplain that we've done, and we can provide that information to you. We'll provide it to Jimmy and his folks as well, so that we can share this information for you. But really, the 4 letters of map change are the administrative process in order to change the maps per structure. Letter map amendment, if you go in and fill an area above the flood elevation and build on top of it, you would want to get a letter of map revision based on fill. And then you have letters of map revision. Those are basically reserved for those areas where you have a large construction type activity that's going to change the physical characteristics of the stream, hence and also the flooding characteristics of the stream. So real quickly, what this graphic depicts is on top is a letter of map amendment. The flood elevation here is about 602. If your lowest floor of your structure is above that 602 elevation, but you're shown in the floodplain on the flood hazard maps on the firms, you can go through this administrative process to remove your structure from the floodplain. On the bottom, we see an area that's been filled above the flood elevation. That would be the letter of map revision based on fill process. About 10 letters of map amendment. So there's been about 10 letters of map amendment this year alone, Jimmy just told me. So, you know, one of the things about maps, especially static maps like these, is they're not perfect, and no flood in nature is ever going to match the flood hazard on a map. What we've done is we've used the best information that we have available in order to identify the flood hazards within Pike County. So there are some administrative processes if the elevations are correct in order to remove your structure if you don't think that you're in the floodplain. We're here to help. We have an outreach specialist, Anne Marie Kaysen. She's with the Division of Water. Her job is to basically go out and work with local communities and citizens to help them understand the flood insurance program and also the flood hazard mapping program. In addition, we have a wonderful contract team that helps us with everything, and I want to give them a big hand because this is a big job in order to get these maps done. The due process phase, like I said, is pretty protracted, but we do like to come and hold these types of meetings and speak with the citizens so that we can get feedback from you guys to make our process better. If we're not continually making our process better, then we're really not doing anyone a favor. So any feedback that you have for us, we're more than welcome to hear. And at this point, that concludes the presentation. And as I mentioned, if anyone has any general questions that they would like to ask the team, now's the time. If there are no questions, we can break out into the individual breakout sessions, and you guys can come and look at your individual properties. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure exactly what you're saying. I'm a little nervous, but I think I want to come across as respectful. You know what I'm saying? But I want to say that I had to pay to get a loan, and without the help of my flood insurance person and Jimmy Hyder and yourself, you emailed me a copy of the map that I had to have done. My husband had been laid off work. And then as soon as he got back to work, we started our loan process, and I got told I had to have flood insurance. My husband, we used to own that home, we didn't have to have flood insurance before. That cost $450 of my hard-earned money to get that. Through my eyes, it's just my elementary way of thinking about it. To me, FEMA painted all the curtains with a blue brush, and you put the burden on the citizens to prove you wrong. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
And I don't think that's fair. And when I'm talking to him respectfully, he said, well, this said by doing this, it'll help FEMA know that their tools that they use to determine who's in the flood zone or not. And it's good, you know, that maybe they need to, I can't remember the exact word.
Increase the fund.
Yeah, but it's not my place to increase the funding. I believe in flood insurance. I'm insurance poor. I'm not an anti-insurance person. I wouldn't live in a place like that by flood. And I'm almost 4 feet above the floodplain.
Right.
I would just like to say, and the reason I'm saying this out loud and not talking to somebody individually, is that all the team that works, it does help all the people. Just know that you gotta be real careful because you're affecting people like
Sure.
us, that there's no reason for me to have flood insurance. We get flooded like home because of my tax.
Well, you're absolutely right. It certainly is a burden to go through the letter map amendment process. But, you know, as I mentioned, you know, part of the process, it gets better as technology evolves. So what we feel is the flood hazards that are depicted on these revised maps are much better quality and more accurate and precise than the flood hazards that were depicted on the older 2008 maps. Right. Well, and you're right. You know, we use the best description of the ground terrain in order to map the flood hazards, and every floodplain on the maps has engineering information that sits behind it. So we try to use the best information available and go through that due process phase if anyone does have a problem with the maps. But I do understand, you know, the letter map amendment process. It's a free process through FEMA, but it does take a surveyor to come in and certify the elevation of the structure in order to submit that information to FEMA, and there is a cost with that. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Could you break down the statement that was made about grandfathering in the insurance?
Certainly, absolutely. Basically, what the grandfathering is if you were in a newly identified flood hazard on these preliminary maps, the maps that we're talking about tonight are still what we call in a preliminary phase, and they'll stay preliminary until they go effective and are adopted by ordinance by the local communities, and that's going to be April of 2013. So the grandfathering provision is if you're in a newly identified floodplain or the flood elevations in your area have gone up. For the most part in Pike County, it's newly identified flood hazard areas. So basically what that means is if you have a federally backed loan and your lender is going to require flood insurance as part of that loan, you would be grandfathered into the new maps when they go effective in 2013. So you would actually get an insurance rate like you were outside the floodplain instead of being identified within the floodplain. And there's a big difference in flood insurance rates as to where you are. If you are in in an identified flood hazard area, the insurance is going to be more expensive than if you are outside a flood hazard area.
So what's the time frame to take advantage of the grandfather part of that?
That's a good question. Between now and 30 days before the new maps go effective, so 30 days prior to April 16th of 2013 is the day. So we're looking at March 16th of 2013 is when you would want to get your flood insurance. Yes, sir.
This question pertains to flood insurance itself. You may not be able to answer this question, but taking this information where folks are grandfathered in, they sign a 1-year contract with a flood insurance provider, and they were grandfathered in, and they get the advantage of the lower rates as we've been encouraging them to. The flood insurance company comes in and reassesses their property, deems them in a flood zone. What happens to their rates? Will they be in that higher rate 1 year later?
That's a good question as well. Basically, the grandfathering provision, there's been some changes at the federal level over the last couple of years, but basically what the grandfathering provision is as long as you get the flood insurance 30 days before the maps go effective, that rate stays constant throughout the life of the loan with a couple of caveats. What it means is there's several different types of flood insurance. There's a Zone A policy, a Zone X policy, and a preferred risk policy. The grandfathering clause basically provides a Zone X policy for those folks that would be grandfathered into the new maps. A preferred risk policy is for someone who is identified completely in the low-risk zone on the flood insurance rate maps. So basically, as long as you are grandfathered into those maps, other than subtle changes for because the flood insurance is basically re-rated every year, and there can be some subtle fluctuations as the cost of flood insurance, but that rate should carry on throughout the life of the loan and can be transferred to subsequent homeowners or business owners as long as there's no lapse in the flood policy. Yes, ma'am.
If you don't have a mortgage, it's about this. Are you still grandfathered in the same way?
Yes, ma'am. That's correct. There's not a federal requirement that you have to have flood insurance if you own your home, but yes, the grandfathering clause does apply if you do own your home as well. Yes, ma'am. And after a disaster, there's also several types of federal assistance that's available. Individual assistance, which helps households and business owners come in and replace things that are lost, and public assistance, which is more designed for rehabilitation of public infrastructure. Yes, ma'am.
Will your firm date change to the new firm date? Like if you're grandfathered in, are you going to keep your original firm date, or are you going to go to the new firm date?
Well, the firm date will become whatever's on the map panel. So in Pike County, there's going to be some map panels that are going to be dated March 13th of 2013, but there's also going to be some map panels that will still have the 2008 date. So it depends on which map panel you're looking at as to what the actual firm date is going to be, and the index panel will change.
If we go into a high-risk area, will that not also place restrictions on how we're covered with the flood insurance?
As far as the coverage, I'm honestly not an insurance specialist. I can talk in broad terms about the flood insurance, and we have some handouts for the actual flood insurance piece. But the actual coverage shouldn't be, to my knowledge, affected.
Well, they do have restrictions on basements and elevated buildings and the such.
There's some mitigation measures that you can take to reduce the costs of flood insurance, such as elevation or relocation or things like that. But the actual rate should be the same.
Well, what about the coverage?
The coverage. I'm sorry. The coverage should be the same. There's building contents. There's building coverage and contents coverage. So you basically have the flood insurance policy covers the actual structure, and then part of the policy also covers the contents of the structure.
Let me give you an example, ma'am. About 2 years ago, a gentleman come in. He had his insurance was going to be $3,600 a year. Just so happens his house was built high enough, but he didn't have his flood vents in. So he had two big openings on each side of his home that he had just left by accident. He put his flood vents in that foundation, and he raised his heat pump 6 inches, and $180,000 worth of insurance went from $3,600 a year to $600 a year, just by doing those two things.
So are these people going to have to be elevated out of the floodplain, their houses now, if we go into these new firm dates?
No. If you're grandfathered in a Zone X, if you're a Zone X now, and you end up being in the floodplain with these new maps, you will carry, if you get your insurance now, you'll carry that Zone X into the new maps if you have the flood insurance policy.
What if you're a Zone AE?
That's putting you in the floodplain. You will still carry that Zone X if you get your insurance before these maps become official.
We'll have full coverage for our house, for any basement, for any rooms that we have built that's been there for the past 60 years. We're going to have full coverage.
That's my understanding.
For whatever's covered in the policy, and that would be something that you would want to discuss with your insurance agent. But yeah, there's coverage for the actual structure and then contents.
But there is limitations with basements and such, though.
There are limitations with basements in identified flood hazard areas, and that's where the grandfathering piece becomes very interesting. But you being grandfathered in, if you do have a basement, you definitely would want to take advantage of the grandfathering flood insurance rate.
Well, either way it goes, the policy just pays for 18 things in a basement.
I'm sorry?
The policy just pays for 18 things in a basement. So if these people have a fully furnished basement, or what the government would, or FEMA would consider a basement, then these people are just going to be paid for 18 things, correct?
Right.
In Zone X, it doesn't matter if you've got a basement. That would be a question that I would ask, or you would ask your insurance agent as far as the coverages, the actual coverage is concerned. And like I said, we do have some documents.
Well, it'd be good to find out now before we have to go into this to know what we're looking at.
Sure.
And we have those handouts that we can provide to you as far as what the flood insurance requirements are. Yes, ma'am.
I live on a hill, and the homeowner's insurance doesn't cover if there's a hillslide. Flood insurance doesn't cover that either. What are you allowed to get? What is there?
Flood insurance covers when there's a general condition of flooding or what is called it's not, I'm trying to remember the regulations. It's not a mudslide, but there's another term for it, but basically a muddy water slide type deal. It is a mudslide. I remember the regulations now. Flood insurance, general condition of flooding, which basically means 2 adjacent structures or more are flooded. So it doesn't have to be a federal disaster declaration, or a mudslide would be covered in that. So if there's a large slide that's considered a mudslide that's mostly water, it's not a landslide, but a mudslide, and I know that term can be interpreted probably fairly loosely. But if it's a mudslide and it affects 2 adjacent properties, the flood insurance would cover that piece.
What if it's just my house and nothing else? Then nothing covers it, is what I was told.
Probably,
Right?
right, yes, ma'am.
Okay, that's what I thought. So there's no point now.
If you're on a hillside, the flood insurance isn't going to cover you for a landslide. Yes, sir.
In this county, we've had 200-year floods within the last couple of years. As the judge said, he's declared disasters on several occasions throughout his terms. Rezoning these to floodplains is all great and fine. The question that I have is, have we identified the source of the problems as to why we're having such enormous flooding so much? Have we analyzed rivers and creeks? Has there been a study to find out, can our rivers and creeks as they are, can they handle the water flow that we have at this point?
That's part of the work that we do, is analyzing the rivers and the creeks, using the information. Rainfall indices over the past several years have increased. We get more rainfall than we did 20 or 30 years ago. Watershed changes can affect flooding, development. Whenever you take trees and forests and replace it with roofs and concrete, you get more water into the streams faster and the water gets higher. So development, certainly in a watershed, changes the characteristics of flooding, but also other activities like mining, like logging, and things like that remove some of that natural capability of the landscape to absorb water and allows it to get to the streams faster. And I certainly don't want to say that mining and logging are a bad thing, but removing some of that vegetation allows the water to get to the streams faster. And it allows it to also stack higher because it gets there quicker. Are there any other? Yes, ma'am.
I work at a financial institution, and when our institution makes a mistake, we reimburse it's made right to the customer. I say this respectfully, but FEMA made a mistake by putting me in the flood zone. Is there any means to go about getting reimbursed the number that was out, for proving you guys made a mistake?
At this point, no, because the maps are created using the best available information available. So as far as the terrain, the description of the ground, how much water gets to the stream, and how high that water gets stacked in the stream channel, the best available information is what's used to depict the flood hazard areas. And that's why FEMA has the administrative process. If there are subtle changes in the landscape that allows a structure to have a higher elevation than what the flood elevation is, there's the letter map amendment process like you went through. But right now, there's no action of recourse for you to get your funding back for your LOMA. Are there any other general? Yes, sir.
Person gets grandfathered in for the lower premium for flood insurance, and then that person later on sells that property to another individual. What's the process as far as keeping that insurance in effect during the transition? Because when you apply for flood insurance, it's an application, it's a 30-day process, and it doesn't go into effect for 30 days.
Right. Get that. The key is get that insurance policy before 30 days before the effective date. Stick it with the deed of the house, and then when the deed is transferred, as long as the flood insurance policy is also transferred to the next homeowner, the rate will remain the same. So that would be my suggestion is, any kind of, if you want to sell a property, let the person that you're selling the property know that you have a grandfathered flood insurance rate. In order for them to keep that rate, they're going to want to take over that policy so that there's no lapse. Yes, sir.
Has there been a determination of how many houses are going to be affected in this process?
The question was is there a determination about how many houses were affected? Yes, we do have. We did do an analysis, and at this point, there were about 666 properties removed from the floodplain on the old maps, and about 640 properties added into the floodplain on the revised maps. So there's a net decrease of properties of about 25, 26 or so. Yes.
Okay, can you explain to the group, is this a routine process, or is it because we had back-to-back $20 million flooding, or is it routine that your agency does it? It's routine all the time.
Sure. The question was is this a routine process for us to go through the flood map update? Yes, it is a routine process. FEMA actually initiated a nationwide program in the 2003-2004 timeframe to revise the flood maps nationwide, because there hadn't been a program to do that in 20 or 30 years, and it had been a long time for most of the floodplain maps nationwide to be revised. But with the advent of the map modernization program, which is what resulted in the flood hazard maps being revised, and also the FEMA risk map program, which is the next evolution of flood hazard identification. Yes, we do have a business plan with the Division of Water that we're required to complete with FEMA that takes us through the year 2020, and it shows the cycle of flood hazard map updates as we roll through Kentucky. And I will say that a lot of that, of course, is dependent upon funding, staff levels, and things like that. But we do have a plan throughout the state to continually update the flood hazards with the latest and greatest information, because as technology evolves, the means to identify flood hazards also evolves and gets better. And the data that we use, especially the terrain data that we use to identify the flood hazards for these map revisions, is excellent. Just by comparison, the old maps, the 2008 and before maps, used USGS data that had about a 40-foot contour. The information that we're using is a 2-foot contour. So if you think of topography, there's a big difference between a 40-foot description of the ground and being accurate anyway, and a 2-foot. So the information is getting better, and I'm assuming that it will continue to get better. So as it does, what our goal is to continually go through, depending upon funding and everything, to keep updating the flood hazards as best as we can. Right. One of the things that Jimmy wanted me to mention was there are new flood hazards identified on the revised firms. Flood hazards that weren't identified before. Now, one thing that I do want to say is that all creeks and streams have a floodplain. It doesn't matter if it's 2 feet wide are 200 feet wide. Every stream has a floodplain. Kentucky has a law, KRS 151, that requires a flood construction permit from the Division of Water for anything along or across a stream that has greater than a 1 square mile drainage area. So basically, if you have a drainage area of 640 acres or more, you have to go through the Division of Water to get a floodplain construction permit for those floodplain areas. These maps coincide with that 1 square mile drainage area in identifying the flood hazards per KRS 151. Answer? All right. Okay, if there aren't any more general questions, like I mentioned before, we have the 2008 maps here. We have the preliminary maps that will be going into effect next April in paper form over there. We have digital versions of the maps at this table here. So what we can do, if you'll tell these folks here at the table where your house is, give us your address, we can locate that, create you a map back here with Mike and Mary, and you can take that home with you.
Excuse me, let me say one thing before we go to. If you could, tell all ye neighbors and friends that if they couldn't make it here tonight, that sometime after the first of the year, I'll have this information on my computer, and they can call me, and I can help them if they couldn't make it here tonight. And another thing that the county does for the citizens of the county too is we're in the CRS program. And when they punch in your community number, you automatically, if you live out in the unincorporated areas of the county, you automatically get a 5% discount on your flood insurance. It's automatically figured in when you punch in that community number. So that's something else that Pike County does for you too. So just wanted you to know.
And that's one of the kudos definitely to Pike County and the city of Pikeville, the CRS program, because that basically what that means is your local government is taking extra steps to protect structures, buildings, and citizens from flooding, so that there's a resultant reduction in the flood insurance costs for everybody within those communities. So kudos to the county and the city for doing that. I want to thank everyone for coming out. If you have any specific questions about your property, please feel free to come up and see Jamie and Drew, and in the back, Mike and Mary, to get your map.